fear of mass immigration has fueled unrest and political change across Europe. The solution usually offered is stronger borders with less attention paid to what is driving this migration and what might encourage migrants to stay at home. Former Chief Constable Gary Roberts has taken up a new role as Executive Director of the Small Countries Financial Management Centre, and he joins me now in the studio to explain how his centre is empowering people to bring opportunity to their small countries. For those who are uninitiated and don't know, what is the Small Countries Financial Management Centre?
Well, at one level, we're a registered charity and we're a company limited by guarantee. But most importantly, we are a charity that believes that small countries, often countries that have survived wars or who have climate challenges or who are in deep poverty, can only begin to thrive if their senior officials are given the highest quality development and the senior officials are given the opportunity to thrive to improve their countries. And that's at the heart of the belief of the charity, and we've worked for 15 years to do that and deliver executive level education to senior people from more than 30 countries around the world.
And of course, having someone like you in charge, bearing in mind your previous role, I imagine that gives a fair amount of confidence to people who may be thinking about sending their officials onto this course.
I hope it does, and I'm having dialogue with people all around the world, and the work that we do is known in many countries. It's supported by big world bodies like the World Bank and the IMF. A couple of weeks ago I was in London where I had a meeting at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office where they'd heard about what we do, they'd heard about the Isle of Man's role in it, the role of the Isle of Man government, and they were keen to see what we did and see whether there was a chance for us to work with them as well, which I think is fantastic for the island.
And obviously you replaced the late Mark Shimon. Mark, of course, formerly Chief Financial Officer at the Treasury. Big shoes to fill.
Mark was a fantastic character. He was a good man, he was well respected, and he put his personal imprint on this charity, and some of the things that Mark did have made a big difference in small places. And you know, I speak to people who are at the heads of central banks and finance ministries and things, and they talk about the impact that Mark had, and that's really quite humbling to know.
So in terms then of the what you do, I think we've probably got a reasonable handle on that now. The other obvious question then is how do you do it? What are the ways in which you allow people from the countries you've described to become experts or experienced administrators, financial regulators, financial enforcers, whatever they may be?
So we take people from three categories of organisation. We take them from finance ministries, we take them from central banks, and we take them from financial services regulators. And we take senior people, usually people who are just below the top level. We take people who've got the potential to go to the top level. And in fact, some of the past alumni of the programme that we run have gone on to run central banks, to be the very senior civil servants in the countries that they come from. And we take them and we give them really top-level executive development. We do some work here, so we have a week here, and thanks to the Vermeulen family, we have free run of the nunnery, and we use the nunnery for our training here. And we also go to the University of Oxford, and we bring in really top-level academics from all around the world. So, for example, this year we had a really top-level academic from Denmark who gave some inspirational leadership development to them. And over a course of 2 weeks, we change them and develop them and bring them on. But importantly, they work on a professional challenge from their own country, and we then monitor that challenge. And in 3 or 4 weeks' time, for example, we're going to be catching up to see the progress they've made on implementing those challenges. And the challenges are far-reaching. For example, one of them this year was about dealing with cryptocurrency and the effect it's having on a very small African state. In another, it was about setting up another African country to become a centre of excellence in combating money laundering. Now, that's really significant stuff, and if we can make a difference to those individuals and they go back and make a difference in their country, well, that's a fantastic thing to do, and it reflects back on the Isle of Man, which is the important bit.
So you're going to be reviewing those case studies, presumably. I mean, what kinds of things can... Because, of course, I think sometimes people just don't have the understanding that perhaps you will now be getting, and I've certainly had through experience of just how far distant some of the systems of governance are in a number of the countries that you'll be dealing with. It's not like the Isle of Man, where government is carried out generally in a fair way, in a way which follows rules and guidance, and certainly in terms of our finance industry, it's very well regulated. Many of the places that you're talking about have very little resource and very little ability to affect the sort of change we've been talking about.
That's exactly right. So on the program we've run, we had 2 people from Montenegro, and Montenegro, a very small country. It fits all of the United Nations indices on what makes a small country, what makes a poor small country, and they're talking to the participants from there. They've emerged from a brutal civil war, and one of the women who was here was telling me about how, as a child, she grew up in a war zone all the time. There was no food, people were being killed, and she still lives in a world where there's a threat of war, where there's a threat from neighbouring countries like Serbia, and where politicians are corrupt. And for her to come here and to be given top-level education that helps her make a difference in her country, to build a better future, and a future where there might not be war, it was really powerful. And the discussion I had with her was quite an emotional one. She became very emotional at one point, talking about the impact that the programme will have, which will allow her to make a difference.
Having the tools and the ability is one thing, but of course overcoming political corruption is quite a different challenge. I suppose at the very least what you're doing is providing the people who come on the courses the tools to be able to challenge things that are clearly not right.
Challenging the paradigms that exist in the countries that these people are from is important, and also creating a network. So we've got an alumni base now of about 660 people, and right around the world there are people who speak highly of the island because of what they've gone through, but also this network allows them to talk to other people in other jurisdictions who've got the same issues. And so if you're in a Caribbean state and you're wrestling with how to regulate a part of the economy, well, there's someone in Africa who's done the same thing, or somebody who in the Indian Ocean, or someone in Asia who's done the same thing, and we put these people together, and allowing people the confidence to say there is a different way of doing that is part of the work that we do, I think.
I mean, you mentioned earlier there the case studies. Are you able to expand a little bit on the hows and how these things can be undertaken? So, for example, I mean, you were talking about combating money laundering in a small African country. I mean, what do the people that come on your courses learn that allows them to affect that sort of change, and what kind of support do they get? What sort of ideas are they coming up with?
We have one this year, for example, where the participant was talking about how to manage and oversee the budgeting of state-owned enterprises in a small country. So if it was here, for example, it would be something like the Manx Utilities Authority, and there was a view in that country that these small state-owned authorities were doing their own thing, and there was no management of their assets, no oversight of their assets, and the consequence of that was money was leaving them. I guess corruptly, money was leaving them. By putting together support and a framework for this person to create a way of overseeing these authorities will mean that money isn't lost to the exchequer in that country, and it can be spent on other things. And so what we do is we dial these individuals into their peers around the world, but also into academics who know stuff. So, for example, on the island we brought in an Oxford academic who is an expert in the financing of small countries, and he's available now to the people who've participated in the programme to give them advice and support remotely.
So effectively, they don't just attend the 2-week course, they then have that ongoing support from the various experts over the course of their specific case study.
And that's an important part. And as I said earlier, one of the participants this year is tasked with creating a centre of excellence to combat money laundering in Africa. Well, we've already dialed them into some experts that we know around the world. But if that challenge succeeds, if money laundering in Africa is combated, Africa is the fastest growing part of the world economy now. The growth in population in places like Nigeria, the amounts of money that are running around the economies in places like Nigeria is huge. But if we can combat money laundering, that's for the benefit of the whole world, not just for the people in Africa.
And it's a big task, of course, doing something like that, because and this was something that I found quite bizarre initially when I used to go out with the International Development Committee to work with Sierra Leone, and it was kind of an accepted part of the culture that the people in charge had to be able to give money to people. That the big chief had to be there with money to hand out. It wasn't significant amounts of money, but they had to have that money. And as a result, they had to get it from somewhere. And quite frankly, in Sierra Leone, there wasn't a big enough economy for the ministers to get the sort of money that they were expected to have. So they tended to dip into whatever funds were available, and that tended to be international development money. And to a certain extent, it was an accepted way of doing things. Now, I know in not Nigeria, in Kenya, they actually acknowledged this as a concept, the concept of the big chief handing the money out. So they actually introduced something in their parliament which meant that each of their parliamentarians was given a certain amount of money to hand out to people as they went about their business, went about visits in their constituencies, because that the best way to combat this was to actually create a system which gave a what's the word I'm looking for, a legitimate way of accessing the money, and they then didn't have to depend on pilfering money out of international development support.
So I guess we're a bit... Tony Blair, when he came into government, said his three priorities were education, education and education. In a way, we see that as being critical. If we educate the elite, if you like, the people who are running the countries, they can see a different way, and it becomes a virtuous thing. Quite early on in the programme this year, we got participants to talk about what motivated them. One of the African participants said that she'd grown up in a children's home, and growing up in a children's home in a poor country was difficult, and she was aware of people, such as politicians, who had lots of money that they shouldn't have. And she was determined to change her world. And from that children's home, she got herself to university, she qualified as a lawyer, and she's now a financial regulator. And her task is to stop the money leaking from the system so it can be spent on kids, to stop them going in children's homes. And that was such a powerful thing to say. And then, it really put into perspective what we were trying to do. And then the obvious question from that is, well, what does the Isle of Man get? Well, the Isle of Man gets from that a stunningly high reputation in some of these countries, and people who've been on the programme and the politicians who support the programme in small countries talk very, very highly of the island.
Well, we'll take a short break now, and we'll expand on the reputational benefit of the programme after the break. You're listening to Perspective with Gary Roberts. One of the things that, of course, the politicians, and many of them wouldn't describe themselves as corrupt. Even the worst examples of corruption that were there, and I'm absolutely convinced the ministers involved knew exactly what they were up to and knew it was wrong. But they would then use the various dirty tricks that are available to politicians, and they would say, yes, these people, they're coming in, the great white saviours coming in, telling us how to run our affairs. We've always run our country in this particular way, and they're coming in trying to tell us this is wrong. But of course, what you're doing is empowering people from the country to make that change.
We're empowering people, and we're showing them that there are different ways, and we're giving them the tools to make a difference, and whether they make a difference or not is down to them. But we can see from case studies that we've got right across the world where a difference has been made. And it's important not to lose sight of the fact that some of these places are very isolated. They're isolated geographically, they're isolated because of their poverty. And for them to access high-level training is something that they've not done before. And these individuals that we deal with go back to their places of work and they make a difference, and we know that they make a difference.
And of course, it's not just the countries that you're helping that recognise the benefit of the course that's provided by the Small Countries Financial Management Centre. There's also a bigger international audience as well. The big international bodies like the World Bank, like the various charities that campaign against tax havens, as they would describe us. These agencies get to see that actually the Isle of Man is involved in something that's really, really positive in terms of helping people make the changes that many of the charities are campaigning for.
It's very easy to kick a place like the island, and the Isle of Man's had a bad press over the summer, really, and it's important to try to offset that. And the work that we do does offset that. Eddie Tear, when he was the Treasury Minister, said that our work shows that the Isle of Man is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I think he was absolutely right, because the virtuous stuff that we do shows that you can make a difference, and it shows that a very small island community can have a social conscience, if you like, and that social conscience allows it to support poorer small countries around the world, which I think is a fantastic thing to do.
And of course, it's not just about a social conscience either, is it? The other thing that's happened over the course of the summer is the terrible events that happened in just across the water from here, with those tragic killings or murders, and then the riots that followed. And the riots that followed are primarily fueled by a fear of immigration. Now, some of that is down to the difficult financial circumstances, which mean that there isn't as much money around as there used to be. But people are choosing to look at immigration as the seat of the problem. The kind of things that the Small Countries Financial Management Centre do, to a certain extent, they encourage people to stay in their countries. It's not a case of discouraging them when they get to the English Channel or either side of the Irish Sea. In our case, this is about encouraging people to stay because they've actually got something, they've got some hope in their countries. Yes,
people migrate because of war, because of famine, because of climate change, but also because of corruption, because opportunities are not there for them. If we can help the professionals in small countries to make the economies of their countries better and stronger, then people will stay where they are because there's a chance for them. And we see us playing a very small part in that. But when we talked to the Foreign Office, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the work that they're trying to do is precisely what we see as being important, where you give small countries the tools and the support, and they build their own economies, and they keep people in work and keep people where they are, which is a very virtuous thing to do.
And of course, one of the advantages of the Isle of Man being a small country and the Small Countries Financial Management Programme being established by people who understand what it is to run a well-regulated small country is that you can talk to small countries in other parts of the world on at their level. I certainly found on occasion organisations like the World Bank or some of indeed the UK Development Agency, that they were looking at things from a much bigger perspective. They were looking at a country of I don't know how big the UK is now. Is it 50 million? Whatever the figure, and trying to take their mindset of how to run a big country like the UK, trying to put that onto a small country. And of course, as we know in the Isle of Man, that you don't have the luxury of the vast amount of money that they would perhaps have in a large country to be able to manage things in the way that a large country would approach it. The Isle of Man has to be smarter than that, and indeed small countries around the world, particularly the ones you're dealing with, have the same issues as the Isle of Man, but magnified because they don't have as much money generally available to them.
Well, one of the sessions that we run on the island is looking at the Isle of Man's economic journey, so that we can show people where the island was in the likes of the 1950s. And you know, if you're not old enough to remember the 50s, then it was a very, very difficult time for people on the island. There was no employment, there was almost no house building, for example, and the island's economy had to grow and diversify and change, and people made a big difference. Some politicians at the time made really important decisions, but we talk on a warts and all basis about where the island has come from, the successes and the mistakes, and the participants get a lot from that. And when we survey them and when we follow up with them, they find that very helpful, because they take that back with them and say, look, there's a small place that actually has been able to thrive, and it's overcome challenges, and they can learn from the Isle of Man.
And of course, it is perhaps difficult for many people to contemplate that the Isle of Man effectively was in very much the same position as many of the countries you're trying to help all those decades ago. There are still people old enough that can remember the difficulties, but certainly as a young man, I remember being told, I mean, with my great passion for the Manx language, we don't want to go back to spuds and herring, and that was the frequent call. And for many people, this was a reality, that they'd ended up having to leave the Isle of Man to go and work in fairly menial jobs in the UK sugar beet industry, whatever it might be, because effectively there was nothing here. There was little hope. There was little prospect on the island.
So you can see the synergy between the island then and these small communities that we deal with, these small countries, and it's important for the participants to know that the Isle of Man has overcome challenges, and the challenges keep coming, and we see ourselves as part of a global drive to make a difference in small places. You know, there's a temptation to think the future's all about very big economies. It's about America or China or India. Small states have got a future, and their future is in their own hands in some ways, and it's whether they choose to make the right decisions. So by equipping their senior public servants in a way that helps them make the right decisions, these small places can thrive.
Do you think people on the Isle of Man get this? Because I'm guessing that many people haven't really thought in huge amount of depth about international development, about how potentially you can support developing countries. And I'm guessing there'll be quite a lot of people, certainly they told me this when I was at MHK, will be saying, well, actually, charity begins at home. We need to make sure that we've got our own people sorted before we start handing over large checks to countries long distance away from ours. Do you think they get this, people on the island?
I think I have a fear that sometimes people don't get it. I know that the government gets it, because I know successive governments going back to 2009 have supported us and have derived benefit from the work that we do. There will be people who think we should spend more at home, and I absolutely understand that. But we live in a global world. We live in a connected world, and a world where the island itself will be prey to bigger powers if we don't show that we're part of the world community and that we're pulling our weight. And the work that we do, I think we stay in lockstep with the Isle of Man government and the policy the Isle of Man government has on international relations, and we play a big part, I think, in showing the Isle of Man is a very worthy community.
Is the danger, and you'll know this from your former role as Chief Constable and having to manage a very, very tight budget, is the danger that when we end up in the financial constraint that we are in, we do tend to focus an awful lot more on the things that we can see most directly, the fact that we don't have the money that perhaps we would have had a couple of decades ago to spend on the level of service that most people would expect in the island, and therefore things like the Small Countries Financial Management Centre are deemed to be a luxury and by no means a necessity.
I can see how people might think that. I think there's a danger of becoming insular in our thinking. And if we're insular in our thinking, we cut ourselves off from opportunities across the world to influence the bigger players. Now, we're due a money val assessment. I don't know when that is. I'm not part of that world anymore, but I think that'll be about 2026. The island will need to show how it combats money laundering and the financing of terrorism and the likes. But if it also tells a story about how it equips other countries to do things like that, small countries that don't remotely have the resources that the Isle of Man has, then that gathers us a lot of credit. And so, yes, I think people are right to say we need to focus on what we do within the island, but we lose out so greatly if we don't focus on outside as well, if we don't look at what does the world out there mean to the Isle of Man and what part does the Isle of Man play in that world out there.
And I suppose the budget that you have in the overall scheme of things is a relatively small amount of Manx taxpayers' money, isn't it?
It is a small amount. We year before last we got 280,000 from the government. We got 300,000 for the programme that we've just run. We try and keep our costs as low as we can. So, for example, we haven't increased the basic rate for our academics since 2012. So we're at the point where at some time I guess we will have to consider increasing it. But we've kept a tight control of costs. I've just been looking at the travel costs over the last 4 years. And setting aside the pandemic year, we've kept the travel costs to pretty much the same as they were in 2019. So we're playing our part, and we're conscious we have to give value for money. But I think the critical thing in this is, what does it say about the Isle of Man? And it says the Isle of Man is this confident, outlooking jurisdiction that wants to do the best for smaller, poorer places.
And there will be people again that will be listening and saying, well, 300,000, that doesn't sound like a small amount of money. But of course, to potentially to get the message that you're describing over in other ways, if you were trying to use advertising, for example, £300,000 wouldn't get you very far in terms of, I don't know, producing programmes, radio programmes, television programmes, whatever they needed to be, glossy adverts in appropriate journals. The 300,000 could be spent very quickly and actually not achieve anywhere near the amount that the programme does.
I've had emails that have come from Prime Ministers of Caribbean states saying thank you to the Isle of Man for what the Isle of Man has done. Some of these small states have found their way to senior levels in world bodies. We've got alumni from our programme who are executive directors in the IMF and the World Bank. We've got people who've gone into the political world, so there are ministers in some of these small countries who've been on the Isle of Man. We've got the attorneys general of several countries who are people who've been through our programme. These people speak internationally about the island, and this is quite an old story, but it's an important one. When George Osborne was the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, we, through contacts that we have, arranged for him to have a one-on-one meeting with the Treasury Minister from the Isle of Man. So the work that we do opens doors, not just to our alumni, but also to people from the Isle of Man. Do you get frustrated in this role? I mean, you haven't been in the role long enough, I suppose, to get too frustrated. But what gives you headaches in this job? Well, we're a charity, so finding funding makes me think a lot. But I get frustrated, actually, in a way, because I can see the potential to do so much more. So it's not just people who work in finance ministries or central banks or financial services regulators who we could benefit. We could benefit parliamentarians. We could benefit senior legal people. We could do programs for judges, for example, because the judges in other countries are not like the judges here. There's corruption within the judiciary in parts of Africa and other places. So we can do a lot more. We can do more for gender inequality. Now, what's interesting in the program we've just run is that every African participant was a woman, and we have played a part, we think, in some of these very small African countries in developing senior leaders who are women. And that's a fantastic thing to do. So that I get frustrated because the potential's there to do so much more. And again, unless you've actually spent time in developing countries, it's hard to understand just how big a deal empowerment of women actually is, because in many countries it's very much run on a sort of the traditional way that
perhaps the Isle of Man was run up until maybe 50 years ago, when it was very much a male-dominated thing. Actually, a number of women listening to the radio, I can feel them saying, actually, it's still not 100% yet.
But that empowerment of women in places like Africa is so important, and we speak to people from organisations like the IMF who now really give their funding to programmes that focus on developing women, because economies change dramatically and societies change dramatically if you empower women and put women into senior positions, and that's we play a part in that now.
How much does climate change impact on the sort of work that you're doing? Because I'm guessing that some small countries will be islands, and if climate science is correct, that those islands are going to be becoming smaller and smaller as land ice melts and starts to swell the seas.
We have participants from small Pacific states where climate change is an existential threat to them, and so we run a session about climate change. We could do more on climate change, and as we keep adjusting the programme based on what these small states need, I think climate change will play a bigger part, and how people deal with managing economies that have got these huge threats from a changing climate are the real significant challenges for people. So we can do some more work in that space.
And I suppose we're back to the way in which the world views a lot of these issues. I mean, we know that there's a fair degree of cynicism about in relation to climate change. There's a fair degree, a lot of cynicism and certain. I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to say anger in relation to immigration. How do we get or reset? Because I mean, you'll have some experience of this in the police too. How do we reset the world so that we start getting to a position where people can believe the information that they read? Because certainly social media has played a very big part in reinforcing people's personal beliefs, their opinions. Suddenly, opinions and personal beliefs become more important than well-researched facts.
Yeah, people seem to think they're allowed their own facts now. There are simply facts, and opinion has taken over. We think that education is key to that. The work that we do by improving the quality and ability of individuals makes a difference, but exposing people to other cultures is so important. So the networking that we have right across the world, where we've got people from countries in Africa who are working on projects with people from the Pacific or Asia, bringing people together across the world is so important, and that helps build understanding. I think that's such a positive thing, and the fact that the Isle of Man is behind that and is responsible for that is really, really powerful.
Do you think we understand enough about the influence of social media? I mean, there's a lot in the non-social media, the mainstream media at the moment, about the influence of social media, and obviously we've had the situation, I forget the fellow's name, the man, the Russian guy who's been not arrested but told he can't leave the country in Paris. This is the man who set up Telegram. Do you think from the perspective of small countries, I'm guessing, as a very well educated, well trained person with a kind of an absolute clarity and a determination to deliver change, to remove corruption, you can only go so far if you have perhaps a well-funded social media campaign which is designed to undermine what you do. Is part of that part of the training as to how you actually deal with messaging?
We talk to them about how to make decisions, how to understand the information that they get, to understand the provenance of the information that they get, so they make the right decisions. And social media plays a part in that, because a lot of it is simply noise that you can ignore, and you need to get down to the facts. So teaching these participants to make decisions that are objective and based on facts and based on evidence is really important. And so we do part of that. Social media can be a force for good, but more often than not now it's a source for things that are not at all good. I heard a podcast the other day where the Premier of South Australia was being interviewed, and he talked about trying to regulate social media to stop young people from being on it. And the arguments he put were compelling. And if you can stop young people being on it, you can influence in a different way so that they understand evidence rather than just things that are on social media.
And that's such a hard thing to do, isn't it? It's once you've let the cat out of the bag, it's very difficult to get the cat to go back in the bag. Not that I'm suggesting at any moment that we should be putting cats in bags, but it's a hard thing to reverse what's happened, and it has happened relatively swiftly. We're talking about possibly a 2-decade change from most people accessing their facts from news outlets such as the BBC, the Manx Radio, Isle of Man newspapers, whoever it may be, who had and probably to a certain extent still have reasonably well funded. What's the word I'm looking for? I've suddenly gone a blank. Journalists to research topics, to understand topics. And to try and give well-balanced coverage so that you understand both the pros and the cons. Some people view this particular piece of information in this way, others view it in a slightly different way. But in that 20 years, we've gone from relying on the well-researched media to actually living in a kind of an information Wild West.
But I think we've just accepted what's come at us without thinking critically about it. And one of the ways we should be countering that is by how we educate young people. So we teach them about sources of information. We teach them critical thinking. We teach them how to know when they're being manipulated online. I think there are state actors, for example, who are manipulating people in the Western world for their own ends, and we walk into it. I think the European Union is about to take some big steps towards regulating social media. It'll be interesting to see how it works, but I think something needs to be done. I noticed yesterday the Brazilian government is threatening to close down Twitter in Brazil, and there's 200 million people in Brazil because of the spread of false information. Now, I just get a sense that around the world some of these big governments are now starting to try to make a difference.
And of course, social media allows, looking at it from the other side of the coin, it would allow people living in poverty to regularly post information so that people in our part of the world could actually properly understand what poverty means, that it's not just about being poor, not just about not knowing where your next meal is coming from, but there's that whole lack of hope for the future because you live in relative squalor. You've got very little to look forward to, and your country is staffed by politicians who really are corrupt and have no intention of helping you get out of the position you're in. So social media has that power to affect that change, but sadly we seem more interested in looking at cute little animals or whatever people get attracted by social media influencers who are telling you what sort of hairstyle you need, and yet we could be finding out so much more about the world.
We could be, and our programme helps the participants to find out about the world away from them. So, we participants that, for example, this time we had a guy from the Maldives who lives with his parents and his grandparents, and in one building he said they keep adding floors to the building because the whole family live in this. So his life experience is so different than mine or many of the other participants, but fascinating nonetheless, and inspiring in many ways that he makes a difference in his small community but he's from this society where the power of family is so good. So some things can counter the negative impacts of social media, such as the power of family.
Do you? I'm guessing one thing that's certainly coming over in this interview is that you are inspired by the people. Do you ever get moved as well by their stories to the extent, just how difficult their lives can be? What sort of emotions do you get?
You get all of the emotions. I got to know all of the participants from this year really quite well, and I was inspired by how they'd overcome difficulties, how, for example, some of them had to walk miles and miles every day to get their education as a child, and they were determined. The story I said before about the woman who'd grown up in the children's home and was determined to make a difference to stop corruption so that money could be spent on young people. People who've lived in war zones. One guy from Timor-Leste, which emerged from Indonesia after a dreadful civil war. The impacts of that are still being felt. How he is determined to make a difference for his children, and we talked about children and how the world that he wants his children to grow up in isn't the world that he grew up in. You feel enormously inspired by these people, and I know that every single one of the 660 who've been here is now an advocate for the Isle of Man, and that's a fantastic thing to achieve.
Is it though? You look at the way the world seems to be heading in a number of ways. The part of the world that we live in, Europe, has much less money available to it than it perhaps would have liked. We've got the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is draining Western coffers as well as presumably Russian coffers, and certainly causing huge amount of devastation in Ukraine. We're not in as confident a place, perhaps globally, as we may have been a few decades ago. That there seems to be this kind of view that the best we can look forward to is managed decline. I mean, certainly that seemed to be the message that the UK Prime Minister was coming out with earlier this week. Tony Blair's theme music was "Things Can Only Get Better." Keir Starmer seems to be leading on "Things Can Only Get Worse," which it's quite hard then, isn't it, to inspire people in this country, or indeed even just convince people that things like the Small Countries Financial Management Centre is worthy of support.
We bring in people from the community to meet our participants. So we put together 2 events where people from all sorts of walks of life come in and meet them. And the number of times people have said to me or written to me to say, thank you for allowing me to be part of that, because these individuals inspired me. That's a significant thing for people to say in the Isle of Man's community, to say, I've been in I've spoken to a group of African women who are senior in their organisations, and I'm inspired. That's absolutely brilliant. I think it's interesting. I think this negativity that you see in this part of the world is not the same as you might see in America. Kamala Harris running for president, she's brought sort of joy and is saying really positive things, saying things about the future can be better. And maybe that's been lost, and maybe we need to learn from people like her.
Do you think that if we are conducting this, a similar interview, maybe in 5 years' time, you'll be talking about substantial success? Where do you hope that the organisation will be over the course of the next 5 years?
Well, I hope at one level we can continue to do what we do now, which is provide the annual programme where we take 20-odd people from around the world. Interestingly enough, this year, for the first time ever, we took an Isle of Man participant. So we had a senior officer from the Isle of Man government for the first time, which I think was really important and really appropriate. And we'd like to do more of that. I think I'd like also for us to be able to extend ourselves into other areas so that we can do work across other parts of the public service that isn't just finance based, but that we continue to sell the Isle of Man for what it is. Social media plays a part in talking the island down a lot of the time. The Isle of Man is a successful, mature nation that is confident in how it approaches the world, and it's done some really good stuff. And the things that it does through the sponsorship of our programme means that it's got a reputation that is really much higher than people who live on the island actually think.
So how do you overcome that? Perhaps I need to do more programs when your guests are over in the future. I know I did one with the late Mark Shimon a few years ago. But how can you keep your story before the public gaze when there are so many other stories that will be competing to draw attention away from the good things that you're up to?
I don't think we should be front and centre of anything. I think we should be there in the background, but I think there ought to be occasions when people see and hear of us. And at one level, we've planted a small forest at the nunnery. We plant a tree every year to commemorate the programme. But I know from what people tell me from around the world, the reputation of the island is enhanced every single year by the work that we do. Now, if I can play my part in reminding people of that and showing people that that's the case, then that's a good thing.
How convinced do you think the members of Tynwald are that this is a worthy way of investing taxpayers' money? Do you have conversations with Tynwald members? Do they get presentations about the work that you do?
I did a presentation to members of Tynwald last autumn, and we got about 30 members there, which is quite significant. I know in a past life when I'd go along, if I'd got 30 there all the time, I'd be pretty pleased. So we did that. We've run a session for members of Tynwald as a parliament, not as a government, where we gave them some development in terms of negotiation and the likes, because we've got academics who work with us, and we provided them with some support on that. I've personally spoken now to most members of Tynwald about the programme, and they say really positive things. I know how very supportive many of them are, because they see the benefits for the island, and they see that the Isle of Man does make a difference through the programme.
And again, I suppose the trying to counteract the Manx sort of cynicism about this. Many people will say, "Well, for goodness sakes, let's cut our cloth accordingly. The Isle of Man is a relatively small country. We shouldn't be presuming that we can influence a global stage."
If you look at one of our competitors, Jersey invests an awful lot of time and effort, more than we do, I think, in its international relations. It has effectively a minister for international relations. Jersey would cut its arm off to be able to run the Small Countries programme. And we've had approaches in the past from the Jersey government about funding us, and we want to be funded here in the Isle of Man by the Isle of Man community, because we know that it does make such a difference to the reputation that the island has.
And that is, I presume, a serious risk if Isle of Man government, for whatever reason, decides it can't afford to fund the programme in the future. You would have to look elsewhere.
We would have to look elsewhere. We'd want to look elsewhere within the island. And one of my roles, I think, is to try to find alternative sources of funding so that we can offset some of the Isle of Man's funding. Talking to the IMF, for example, we potentially we can get some funding from them to help run some programs in the Caribbean and in Africa, for example. We've previously run one program in for the IMF in Africa. We ran one for the Cook Islands government in the Pacific. So we can do stuff like that. Our last independent assessment of our work was funded by the Commonwealth. So we do go outside and we look for other funding, but we are enormously grateful for the support that we get from the Isle of Man government. And
I suppose then one word answers, because we are now at the end of the programme, reasonably optimistic for the future.
I generally think I'm a glass half full person. So yes, the organisation will have a future, however we're funded.
That was Gary Roberts, Executive Director of the Small Countries Financial Management Centre. So what do you think? Charity may well begin at home, but does it make sense to be helping countries less fortunate than ours to have opportunity and hope? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Myos and Geisach Rum. Thanks for listening.